In 1940, the strongest army in Europe collapsed in just 6 weeks. No long siege, no heroic last stand, just speed, shock, and destruction. France trusted walls, Germany trusted movement. While millions slept in false security, an unstoppable storm was already rolling through the Ardennes. Roads filled with fleeing families, soldiers trapped on burning beaches, and a nation forced to its knees. This is not just a battle. This is the moment Europe changed forever. Stay with me, because what really happened in the Battle of France is far darker than you were ever told. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. The year was 1940. Europe stood on the edge of a knife, trembling between hope and despair. The shadows of World War I still lingered across the fields of France, where millions had once bled, where families had mourned, where entire generations had been scarred beyond healing. And yet, despite those lessons of devastation, war returned, faster, colder, and far more ruthless than anyone had imagined. For 8 long months after Germany invaded Poland, there had been silence on the Western Front. A strange, haunting stillness. They called it the Phoney War. Soldiers waited in trenches that smelled of mud, rust, and old memories. French and British troops stared across the border of Germany, believing that if they simply held their ground behind the mighty Maginot Line, they would be safe. They believed that history would repeat itself. Slow, grinding, trench-by-trench warfare. But Adolf Hitler did not intend to fight the war of the past. He had studied it. He had learned from it. And on May 10th, 1940, that illusion of safety shattered like glass. At dawn, the sky darkened with the roar of German aircraft. Bombers droned overhead, dropping their deadly cargo onto airfields, railways, and cities. Sirens wailed across France. Civilians fled in panic, clutching children, dragging suitcases, and abandoning homes they would never see again. Roads became rivers of human desperation. While the Allies braced for a frontal assault through Belgium, exactly as they expected, the German army moved like a coiled serpent through the Ardennes forest, a place the French High Command had dismissed as impenetrable. Thick trees, narrow roads, rugged terrain. Surely no modern army could pass through there with tanks. But the Germans did. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, tore through the forest. Panzer divisions rumbled forward like iron beasts, cutting through French defenses with terrifying speed. Infantry followed, organized, disciplined, relentless. Communications collapsed. Orders became confusion. Confidence turned into fear. Within days, the German spearhead reached the Meuse River. French defenders fought bravely, but they were outmaneuvered, outpaced, and outmatched. Bridges were seized, lines were broken. The front that France had trusted for decades began to crumble. In Paris, politicians argued while the nation burned. Generals hesitated while soldiers died. The French army, once the pride of Europe, found itself trapped in a nightmare it could not control. Meanwhile, in the north, British and French forces pushed into Belgium, only to realize too late that they had walked straight into a trap. The German army swept behind them, cutting them off from the rest of France. Thousands of men suddenly found themselves surrounded. This led to one of the most dramatic moments of the war, Dunkirk. On the beaches of northern France, over 300,000 Allied soldiers stood with their backs to the sea, waiting for rescue or annihilation. Shells exploded in the distance. German aircraft strafed the shore. The air tasted like smoke and salt and fear. But in this moment of utter despair, something remarkable happened. Ordinary people, fishermen, sailors, ferry captains, sailed their small boats across the English Channel under fire to bring soldiers home. It was chaos. It was heroism. It was humanity refusing to surrender to darkness. Yet while Dunkirk became a symbol of survival, the battle for France was far from over. To the south, the French army fought desperately, but the German advance was unstoppable. Cities fell, Villages were occupied. Soldiers fought knowing their cause was slipping away. On June 14, 1940, German troops marched into Paris, the same streets that had once celebrated victory in World War I, now echoed with the boots of an enemy army. The Eiffel Tower stood silent, a witness to the fall of a nation. And then, on June 22, 1940, France surrendered, not defeated in spirit, but overwhelmed by a new kind of war it was not prepared to fight. But the story of France did not end there. From the ashes of defeat, resistance was born. In hidden basements, secret radio stations, and quiet country homes, French men and women began to fight back, not with tanks or planes, but with courage, intelligence, and defiance. The Battle of France was not just a military defeat, it was a human tragedy, families torn apart, cities scarred, dreams shattered. But it was also a lesson, a brutal reminder that in war, arrogance, complacency, and miscalculation can cost everything. And when the war finally ended in 1945, France rose again, battered, wounded, but unbroken. The Battle of France 1940 stands as one of history's most dramatic turning points, a story of power, failure, resilience, and the unbreakable will of a people, who refused to vanish into the darkness of tyranny. France entered 1939 carrying the weight of its past, like a steel armor wrapped around a wounded body. The scars of the Great War were everywhere, in ruined villages that had never fully been rebuilt, in widows dressed in black, in fields that still carried the bones of fallen soldiers beneath their soil. The French people, their leaders, and their military planners were haunted by memories of Verdun, the Somme, and the endless trench warfare that had bled their nation dry. Out of this trauma grew a singular obsession. Never again would France allow itself to be dragged into a war of attrition on its own soil. This obsession took physical form in the Maginot Line, a massive system of fortifications stretching along France's eastern border with Germany. It was not merely a wall, it was an engineering marvel of its time, a labyrinth of concrete bunkers, underground tunnels, artillery positions, observation posts, and living quarters buried deep beneath the earth. Soldiers stationed there lived in a hidden world of steel doors, electric lights, rail systems, and ventilation shafts, as if they were part of a vast, silent underground city built specifically to resist the brutality of modern warfare. To many in France, the Maginot Line was a symbol of safety, a promise that the horrors of 1914 would never be repeated. Newspapers and politicians spoke of it with pride, describing it as impenetrable, unbreakable, and invincible. The public took comfort in the idea that if Germany ever dared to attack again, they would crash against this wall of concrete and steel, just as they had once been ground down in the trenches of World War I. The psychological reassurance it provided was almost as powerful as its physical defenses, yet beneath this confidence lay a dangerous assumption that the next war would look like the last one. French military doctrine was deeply rooted in defensive thinking. Their strategy revolved around holding fortified positions, waiting for the enemy to exhaust themselves, and relying on Britain and other allies for support. The Maginot Line embodied this mindset perfectly, a monument to preparation but also to rigidity, a fortress built against a war that no longer existed. Meanwhile, across the border, Germany was changing in ways that France failed to fully grasp. Adolf Hitler had risen to power, rearmed the nation in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles, and reshaped the German military into a force designed for speed, mobility, and psychological shock. But in France, many still viewed Germany through the lens of 1918, imagining a slow, grinding conflict rather than a rapid, mechanized onslaught. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, France and Britain declared war, but the response on the Western Front was strangely muted. Instead of immediate, large-scale fighting, An eerie calm settled over the border. Soldiers dug into their positions, exchanged occasional artillery fire, and waited. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. This period became known as the Phoney War, a conflict in name only, where armies faced each other but rarely clashed. In French towns and cities, life continued in a fragile state of normalcy. Cafes remained open, children went to school, and trains still ran on schedule. Yet beneath this surface calm, anxiety simmered. Families wondered when the real war would begin. Mothers feared for sons stationed near the border. Fathers read headlines that spoke of tension, but not battle. The nation existed in a suspended moment between peace and catastrophe. On the Maginot Line itself, soldiers settled into a routine that felt almost surreal. They played cards, wrote letters home, maintained their equipment, and stood watch in concrete observation posts that overlooked empty fields. Some believed that if they simply held their positions long enough, the war might end without ever truly reaching them. Others sensed that this stillness was merely the calm before a storm, yet this waiting bred complacency. Many French officers became convinced that the enemy would eventually attack head-on, just as in the previous war. They dismissed reports of German innovation, underestimating the growing power of tanks, aircraft, and coordinated mechanized warfare. The very strength of the Maginot Line became a weakness, encouraging a false sense of security that dulled their urgency and imagination. Beyond the fortified border, French military planners made another critical miscalculation. They believed that if Germany did attack, it would come through Belgium, just as it had in 1914. As a result, much of France's mobile forces were positioned to move northward in response, leaving other areas less defended. The Ardennes forest, a dense, rugged region to the southeast, was considered unsuitable for large-scale military movement and was therefore lightly guarded. All the while, Germany was observing, planning, and preparing. Behind the scenes, they were assembling a force unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Columns of tanks, mechanized infantry, and air squadrons designed to strike with blinding speed. But from the French perspective, these preparations were distant and abstract, overshadowed by the reassuring presence of their grand defensive line. The Phoney War also took a psychological toll. Soldiers grew restless. Some questioned why they were even there if no fighting was happening. Others felt a creeping dread, sensing that the longer they waited, the worse the eventual battle would be. The quiet became its own kind of torture, a reminder that death could arrive at any moment without warning. In Paris, political leaders debated strategy, argued over alliances, and struggled to maintain national unity. The memory of World War I loomed over every decision, making them cautious, hesitant, and at times indecisive. Fear of repeating past mistakes often paralyzed them, preventing bold action when it might have made a difference. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens lived in a strange dual reality. They stocked ration supplies, prepared bomb shelters, and listened to radio broadcasts that spoke of war in distant places. Yet many still went about their daily lives as if the conflict were something happening elsewhere, far beyond their borders. This illusion of security, built on concrete history and hope, became the defining feature of France in early 1940. The Maginot Line stood as both a shield and a trap, protecting the nation from one kind of war while blinding it to another. The Phoney War masked the approaching disaster, lulling France into a dangerous state of calm that would soon be shattered with brutal force. At first, the Ardennes seemed like a natural barrier, a tangled wilderness that history itself had chosen as a shield. Thick forests stretched for miles, their dark green canopies swallowing light and sound, broken only by narrow, winding roads that twisted through deep valleys and rocky hills. To the French High Command, this terrain represented safety through impossibility. They believed no modern army, especially one burdened with heavy tanks, artillery, and supply convoys, could meaningfully pass through it. Maps marked the region as difficult, secondary, almost irrelevant to the main theater of war. In their minds, the real battle would unfold far to the north, across open plains where armies could maneuver as they had in the last war. Yet within this very forest, something unprecedented was taking shape. Long before May 1940, German planners had studied the Ardennes with a predatory patience. Unlike the French, they did not see only obstacles, they saw opportunity. General Erich von Manstein proposed a daring plan to thrust the heart of Germany's armored forces straight through this impenetrable terrain, cross the Meuse River, and slice behind Allied lines before they even understood what was happening. It was a gamble that bordered on madness, but it carried the promise of decisive victory. In the early hours of May 10th, 1940, the illusion of calm dissolved. The sky over Europe filled with the low, mechanical roar of aircraft. German Luftwaffe bombers streaked across the horizon, their engines vibrating the air like an approaching storm. Explosions ripped through airfields, rail stations, and communication hubs. In cities and villages across France and Belgium, people were jolted awake by sirens, shattering glass, and the trembling of the ground beneath their feet, while much of the Allied attention focused on German attacks in Belgium and the Netherlands. Something far more dangerous was unfolding in the shadows of the Ardennes. Columns of German Panzer divisions began to move, not slowly, not cautiously, but with a relentless, almost surgical precision. Tanks rumbled forward like steel beasts, their tracks chewing through mud, crushing fallen branches and grinding along narrow forest roads never meant for such weight. Behind them followed waves of mechanized infantry and half-tracks, artillery units and supply vehicles, all woven together in a tightly coordinated machine of war. Radio crackled constantly with orders, updates, and battlefield intelligence, allowing German commanders to adapt in real time, something the French army, still reliant on slower calm. Unification methods could not match the terrain that the French believed would slow the Germans, instead became their cover. Trees concealed movement from aerial reconnaissance, and the winding roads prevented Allied forces from realizing just how massive and concentrated the German advance truly was. To many French soldiers stationed nearby, the Ardennes still felt quiet, distant, almost irrelevant, even as danger crept closer with every passing hour. As the German columns pressed deeper, they encountered resistance, scattered French units, small defensive positions, and hastily assembled roadblocks. But these were overwhelmed with terrifying speed. Panzer tanks blasted through obstacles with brute force, while dive bombers swooped low to break enemy morale and scatter defenders. What should have been a slow, grinding advance instead became a devastating breakthrough. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, was not just a tactic, but an entirely new way of fighting. It relied on speed, surprise, coordination, and psychological shock. Instead of pushing forward inch by inch, the Germans aimed to shatter command structures, paralyze decision-making, and create chaos faster than their enemies could respond. Every minute mattered, every mile gained multiplied their advantage. Within days, the German spearhead reached the Meuse River, a critical defensive line that the French believed would halt their progress. The river, wide and powerful, was supposed to be a natural barrier guarded by entrenched French troops and fortified positions along its banks. For many in the French army, this was the moment where the German advance would finally be stopped. But the Germans did not hesitate. Under the cover of intense artillery fire and relentless air bombardment, German engineers and assault troops began crossing the Meuse using pontoon bridges, rafts, and improvised means. French defenders fought desperately, firing machine guns and artillery into the advancing waves, watching as smoke and explosions filled the air. The river bank became a scene of chaos. Water churned with debris, fallen soldiers, and shattered equipment, yet the Germans pressed on with brutal determination. Once across, their tanks surged forward again, spreading like a tidal wave into the French rear. Communication lines broke down, orders became confused or never arrived at all. Units that should have been coordinated found themselves isolated, fighting blind against an enemy they could barely locate. In French command centers far from the front, disbelief slowly turned into panic. Reports poured in of German tanks far beyond where they were supposed to be, cutting roads, capturing towns, and threatening supply routes. Maps that once showed neat lines of defense now looked like shattered glass, riddled with holes and ruptures. Soldiers on the ground experienced this collapse in a deeply personal way. Some found themselves suddenly surrounded, cut off from their comrades with no clear path of retreat. Others retreated in disorder, abandoning equipment, vehicles, and even wounded men in their haste to escape. What had once been an organized army began to fracture under the sheer speed and ferocity of the German advance. Civilians caught in the path of this blitzkrieg faced their own nightmare. Families fled in packed cars, horse-drawn carts, or on foot, carrying whatever they could grab in moments of terror. Roads became clogged with refugees, soldiers, and military vehicles, creating scenes of confusion that further hampered any attempt at organized defense. Meanwhile, German forces continued their push westward, cutting deeper into France with astonishing momentum. Their goal was not simply to defeat French troops, but to encircle and destroy entire armies. By slicing through the Ardennes and racing toward the English Channel, they aimed to trap the British Expeditionary Force and large portions of the French army in a massive pincer movement. The brilliance and brutality of this strategy lay in its psychological impact. As towns fell and front lines collapsed, morale crumbled. Soldiers who had been confident only days earlier now faced the horrifying realization that they were being outmaneuvered at every turn. Many began to feel that the war was already lost, even as they continued to fight. French generals trained in the traditions of World War I struggled to adapt to this new form of warfare. They were used to slow battles fought along clear lines, not rapid thrusts that blurred the concept of a front. By the time they attempted to reorganize or counterattack, the Germans had already moved miles ahead. The Ardennes, once dismissed as irrelevant, had become the gateway to disaster. What had seemed like an impossible path for an army turned into the very route that sealed France's fate. The forest that had symbolized safety now echoed with the thunder of tanks, the scream of aircraft, and the distant cries of men caught in a war they barely understood. As the German Blitzkrieg rolled onward, it left behind not just destroyed defenses, but shattered assumptions. The Battle of France was no longer a distant possibility. It was an unstoppable reality racing toward the heart of the nation. The collapse did not happen all at once. It unraveled piece by piece like a vast, intricate structure coming apart under pressure it was never designed to withstand. At the beginning of May 1940, the Allied command still believed they understood the shape of the war. Maps were neat, strategies were orderly, and assumptions were treated as facts. French and British planners had convinced themselves that if Germany attacked, it would follow a familiar script: a major thrust through Belgium, a grinding battle along well-defined lines, and a slow war position where industrial strength and endurance would decide the outcome. This belief shaped every decision they made. When German forces struck on May 10th, the Allied response unfolded almost automatically, like a pre-rehearsed performance. The British Expeditionary Force and some of France's best mobile divisions advanced northward into Belgium, just as they had planned for years. Trains carried soldiers, trucks rolled along highways, and armored units moved forward with confidence, believing they were stepping into the main battlefield of the campaign. For a brief moment, it appeared as if everything was proceeding according to expectation. Allied troops crossed the border, linked up with Belgian forces, and prepared to meet the German army head-on. Officers issued orders with the calm certainty of men who believed they were fighting a war they already understood. But while the Allies marched north, the real danger was already slipping behind them. German armored divisions, having burst through the Ardennes, were not trying to fight the Allied armies in Belgium. They were racing past them, slicing toward the English Channel with ruthless speed. Roads that the Allies had assumed were safely behind their lines suddenly echoed with the rumble of enemy tanks. Towns thought to be far from danger found themselves under attack without warning. At Allied headquarters, confusion began to seep in like a slow poison. Reports arrived that did not fit the picture in their minds. German tanks were spotted far to the south of where they were supposed to be. Communications with forward units became erratic. Messages contradicted one another. Some commanders insisted the situation was still under control, while others warned of impending catastrophe. French command structures, already strained by outdated doctrines, struggled under the weight of this new reality. Many senior officers had built their careers studying World War I battlefields, not fast-moving armored warfare. Their instinct was to hold positions, reinforce weak points, and restore a continuous front line. But Blitzkrieg did not allow for such neat solutions. By the time a defensive line was organized, the Germans were already miles beyond it. Coordination between French and British forces, always fragile, began to break down. Different armies had different priorities, different levels of mobility, and different interpretations of what was happening. While the British focused on protecting their troops and maintaining a possible line of retreat, many French commanders still tried to salvage a conventional defense of the country. On the ground, this disconnection translated into chaos. Entire French divisions found themselves cut off from their supply routes. Orders arrived too late or not at all. Units that were meant to support each other became isolated, fighting in pockets without knowledge of the broader situation. Radios failed, messengers were captured or killed, and the fog of war grew thicker with every passing hour. Soldiers who had trained for years to defend their homeland suddenly felt like pieces on a board they no longer recognized. Some fought with stubborn bravery, holding towns, bridges, and crossroads against overwhelming odds. Others, overwhelmed by the speed and intensity of the German advance, retreated in disorder, abandoning positions they'd been told were vital only days before. Civilians, caught in the middle of this unraveling front, added another layer of turmoil. Millions of French men, women, and children began to flee southward in what became known as the Exodus. Cars packed with families clogged the roads alongside military convoys, ambulances, and retreating soldiers. Horse-drawn carts creaked under the weight of belongings piled high. Mattresses, furniture, livestock, photographs, anything that could be carried. This flood of refugees made movement even more difficult for the Allied armies. Tanks and trucks struggled to navigate through the human tide. Bridges became bottlenecks. Traffic jams stretched for miles. In some places, soldiers were forced to divert or delay movements because the roads were completely blocked by terrified civilians. Meanwhile, German forces exploited every crack in the Allied defenses with surgical precision. Dive bombers, the dreaded Stukas, screamed out of the sky to terrorize retreating columns, scattering troops and civilians alike. Armored units bypassed strong points, leaving isolated French positions surrounded and irrelevant. What could not be crushed was simply cut off and left to wither. At the strategic level, Allied miscalculation became painfully clear. The decision to move so many elite forces into Belgium left central and southern France dangerously exposed. When the German breakthrough in the Ardennes turned into a full-scale advance, there were too few reserves in place to stop it. French political leadership, already unstable, began to fracture under the strain. Ministers argued, generals blamed one another, and confidence in the government eroded rapidly. Some still believed that with enough reinforcements and counterattacks, the situation could be reversed. Others, more realistic or more defeated, began to speak openly of inevitable collapse. British leaders watching events unfold grew increasingly concerned not just for France, but for their own army. The British Expeditionary Force, deep inside Belgium, now faced the terrifying possibility of being cut off from the sea. What had started as a confident advance now felt like a trap closing around them. French commanders attempted desperate counterattacks, throwing whatever forces they could gather against the German spearheads. But these efforts were often poorly coordinated, under-supported, and quickly overwhelmed by superior German tactics and air power. Each failed attack drained morale further. Within days, the neat lines on Allied maps had dissolved into a chaotic web of advances, retreats, and encirclements. Towns changed hands repeatedly. Entire units disappeared from communication. The idea of a stable front no longer existed for ordinary soldiers. This collapse was not an abstract strategic failure. It was deeply personal and terrifying. Men who had been confident defenders of their nation found themselves disoriented, exhausted, and often alone. They saw comrades killed or captured, equipment destroyed, and the country they loved slipping away before their eyes. The French army, once considered among the strongest in the world, was not defeated because its soldiers lacked courage. Many fought with remarkable bravery, but they were trapped in a system that had failed them, a system built on outdated assumptions, poor coordination, and an inability to adapt to a radically new kind of war. As German forces surged toward the Channel, the full scale of the Allied miscalculation became undeniable. What had been intended as a strong forward defense had instead created the perfect conditions for disaster. The very movements meant to protect France had left it vulnerable in ways no one had anticipated. And with every mile the Germans advanced, the sense of inevitability grew stronger, not as a distant possibility, but as a crushing reality bearing down on an army and a nation that could no longer keep pace with the speed of its own downfall. The northern coast of France in late May 1940 became a place where time itself seemed to stretch, bend, and fracture. What had once been quiet beaches, lined with gentle dunes and small fishing towns, transformed into a vast stage of human desperation, where the fate of hundreds of thousands of men hung in the balance. The Allied armies, British, French, Belgian, and others, found themselves pressed into an ever-shrinking pocket around the port town of Dunkirk, their backs to the cold gray waters of the English Channel, with the German army closing in from nearly every direction. The soldiers who gathered there were exhausted in ways that went far beyond physical fatigue. Many had been marching, fighting, retreating, and sleeping in muddy fields for days with little food or rest. Their uniforms were torn and stained, boots worn thin, faces lined with grime and sleeplessness. Some clutched rifles so tightly that their knuckles had turned white. Others stared blankly toward the horizon, too overwhelmed to process what was happening. From the beaches, they could hear the distant thunder of artillery, a constant reminder that the enemy was drawing closer. The sound rolled across the flat landscape like an approaching storm, shaking the air and rattling the nerves of every man who stood there. Overhead, German aircraft droned through the sky, their dark silhouettes cutting across the clouds, diving down to strafe the shore or drop their deadly payloads among the waiting troops. The beach itself was a scene of controlled chaos that teetered constantly on the edge of panic. Long lines of soldiers stretched for miles, snaking through the sand toward whatever boats they could find. Some men waded into the shallow water, holding their weapons above their DS, hoping to reach waiting ships anchored offshore. Others crowded onto damaged piers that groaned under the weight of so many desperate bodies. Abandoned equipment littered the shore: rifles, helmets, trucks, artillery pieces, and even tanks, left behind in the rush to escape. To many soldiers, abandoning their gear felt like abandoning a part of themselves, a painful admission that survival now mattered more than anything else. The sand was scarred with tire tracks, boot prints, and the marks of explosions, as if the beach itself had become a battlefield. In the skies above, a different kind of battle raged. British Spitfires and Hurricanes clashed with German fighters in swirling dogfights that painted the heavens with trails of smoke. The roar of engines, the crack of gunfire, and the occasional fiery descent of a shot-down plane filled the air. Every man on the beach looked up with a mix of fear and gratitude, knowing that without these pilots, the evacuation would be even more impossible. Out at sea, a remarkable and unlikely rescue operation was taking shape. The British government, realizing that a disaster of unimaginable scale was unfolding, called upon not only the Royal Navy but also ordinary civilians to help save their soldiers. What followed was one of the most extraordinary acts of collective courage in modern history. Fishermen, yacht owners, ferry captains, and small boat operators answered the call without hesitation. These were not trained naval crews. They were everyday people, fathers, sons, neighbors, who set out across the channel in vessels never meant for war: wooden fishing boats, pleasure yachts, lifeboats, and even converted paddle steamers cut through the choppy waters toward Dunkirk, driven by a shared sense of duty and humanity. As these small ships approached the shore, they came under fire from German aircraft and artillery. Some were hit and sank, their crews and passengers swallowed by the cold sea. Others pressed on, navigating through wreckage, burning ships, and floating debris, guided by nothing but determination and the desperate knowledge that lives depended on them. On the beaches, the arrival of each small boat brought both hope and heartbreak. Soldiers rushed toward them, clambering aboard in a frantic scramble that often bordered on chaos. Space was limited and decisions had to be made quickly. Officers tried to maintain order, selecting men based on unit rank or sheer urgency, while others slipped through the cracks left behind as the boats pulled away. Many soldiers stood waist-deep in the icy water, shivering as they waited their turn, watching ship after ship depart, with only a fraction of the men they needed to carry. Some prayed silently, others shouted for help. A few simply stared at the horizon, numb to everything around them. Back in Britain, families gathered around radios, listening to updates that came in fragments and often contradicted one another. Mothers wondered if the heir sons were among those trapped on the beaches. Wives clutched photographs of husbands they might never see again. The entire nation held its breath, suspended between fear and fragile hope. Despite the relentless danger, moments of quiet humanity emerged amid the horror. Soldiers shared rations with strangers, helped wounded comrades onto boats, or simply sat together in silence, united by their shared ordeal. Some wrote last letters in case they did not make it out, scribbling hasty messages on scraps of paper that might never reach home. German forces, for reasons still debated by historians, did not press their attack with full intensity during the critical days of the evacuation. Whether due to logistical concerns, strategic caution, or orders from higher command, their advance slowed just enough to allow the rescue to continue. To the men on the beach, this pause felt like a miracle, a brief window of mercy in an otherwise merciless war. Night brought a different kind of terror. In the darkness, German bombers returned, their engines echoing across the water. Explosions lit up the sky in flashes of orange and red, casting long distorted shadows across the sand. Soldiers huddled together, unsure if dawn would ever come or if they would still be alive to see it. Yet through it all, the evacuation continued, day and night, wave after wave of boats shuttling men across the channel. The operation, known as Dynamo, became a race against time, a fragile lifeline stretching across dangerous waters. By the time it was over, more than 330,000 Allied soldiers had been rescued, a number that seemed almost unbelievable given the circumstances. But this triumph came at a heavy cost. Thousands more had been killed, wounded, or captured. Vast amounts of military equipment had been lost, leaving the Allied armies severely weakened. For the soldiers who made it back to Britain, the experience of Dunkirk left scars that would never fully fade. Many felt a deep sense of shame for having been forced to retreat, even though their survival had been an extraordinary achievement. Others carried haunting memories of friends left behind, of burning ships, of the cries of wounded men echoing across the water. For those who had fought and died there, Dunkirk became a final tragic chapter of their story, their sacrifice, woven into the larger tapestry of the war. For those who lived, it was both a rescue and a painful reminder of how close they had come to annihilation. Dunkirk was not a victory in the traditional sense, but it was something more complex and deeply human, a testament to resilience, courage, and the refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds. It revealed the best and worst of war, the cruelty of conflict, and the extraordinary capacity for compassion and bravery that can emerge within it. The fall of France did not arrive as a single dramatic moment, but as a slow, suffocating collapse that settled over the country like a heavy and inescapable fog. By mid-June 1940, the front lines that once defined the battlefield had dissolved into scattered skirmishes, chaotic retreats, and isolated pockets of resistance. French soldiers, many still willing to fight, found themselves abandoned by logistics, betrayed by failing communications, and overwhelmed by an enemy that moved faster than their own command to comprehend. Across the nation, the mood shifted from disbelief to despair. Cities that had once buzzed with life now echoed with the rumble of distant artillery and the drone of German aircraft. In Paris, crowds gathered silently in public squares, listening to radio broadcasts that spoke in grim, carefully measured tones about difficult decisions and national survival. The government, fractured and desperate, relocated from the capital to Bordeaux, leaving behind a city that had stood as a symbol of French culture, pride, and resilience. On June 14, 1940, German troops marched into Paris. The image of their columns moving down the Champs-Élysées, past the Arc de Triomphe, and toward the Eiffel Tower became one of the most haunting scenes of the war. For many French citizens, this moment felt like a personal humiliation, as if the very soul of their nation had been violated. Windows were shuttered, doors were locked, and people turned away rather than watch the conquerors claim their streets. 2 days later, on June 16th, Marshal Philippe Pétain addressed the French people in a somber radio speech, declaring that the fighting must stop. His words were heavy with resignation, framed as a necessary sacrifice to spare France further suffering. For some, this announcement brought a painful sense of relief. For others, it felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than any battlefield wound. On June 22, 1940, France formally signed an armistice with Germany in the same railway carriage at Compiègne, where Germany had been forced to surrender in 1918. The symbolism was deliberate and cruel. What had once been a moment of French triumph was now transformed into a scene of national defeat. Cameras captured German officers standing tall and confident, while French representatives appeared exhausted, broken, and powerless under the terms of the armistice. France was divided. The northern and western regions, including Paris, fell under direct German occupation. The southern portion became Vichy France, a nominally independent regime led by Pétain, but heavily influenced, controlled, and pressured by Nazi Germany. Overnight, families found themselves separated by invisible lines drawn across maps, unable to move freely through their own country. Life under occupation began with a deceptive calm. German soldiers established checkpoints, patrolled streets, and took over government buildings, hotels, and homes. In many places, daily routines continued. Bakeries opened, children went to school, trains still ran, but everything now operated under the shadow of an occupying power. Posters in German appeared alongside French, and the presence of armed soldiers became an unavoidable part of everyday life. Yet beneath this surface normality, fear and tension simmered constantly. Curfews were imposed. Radios were censored. Newspapers were controlled, flooded with propaganda that praised German order and condemned Allied aggression. Whispered conversations replaced open debate. People learned to watch what they said, even in their own homes, unsure who might be listening. For French Jews, the occupation brought immediate and growing danger. Anti-Semitic laws were introduced, stripping them of rights, jobs, and dignity. They were forced to register, wear identifying badges, and live in constant fear of arrest and deportation. Many tried to flee, hide, or secure false documents, while others placed their trust in neighbors or underground networks that had yet to fully form. Economically, the country began to suffocate. Food shortages spread as Germany requisitioned supplies for its own war effort. Ration cards became a part of daily life, dictating how much bread, meat, or fuel a family could receive. Black markets emerged in back alleys and rural villages where desperate people traded valuables for basic necessities. Hunger crept into homes that had never known it before. German officers moved into French houses, often forcing families to share their own living spaces with the enemy. In some cases, this led to tense, silent coexistence. In others, it bred resentment, conflict, and heartbreak. Every interaction carried the weight of power imbalance, a reminder that France was no longer master of its own destiny. Yet even as defeat settled over the land, something quietly began to stir beneath the surface. In attics, basements, and hidden rooms, small groups of men and women started to talk in hushed voices about resistance. At first, these were isolated acts, a radio tuned secretly to the BBC, a piece of graffiti scrawled on a wall in the dead of night, a leaflet slipped under a door. But these tiny sparks of defiance carried enormous meaning in a country forced into silence. One of the most powerful symbols of this emerging resistance came from a voice that many French people heard from across the Channel. On June 18, 1940, General Charles de Gaulle, speaking from London, delivered a radio broadcast urging the French people to continue the fight. His words, though heard by only a small audience at first, resonated deeply with those who refused to accept defeat. He spoke of honor, duty, and the belief that France was not finished. Those who answered this call became the foundation of the French resistance. Resistance took many forms. Some joined underground networks that gathered intelligence on German troop movements, fortifications, and supply lines, passing this information to the Allies through secret radio transmissions. Others engaged in sabotage, blowing up railways, disrupting communications, or damaging factories that supported the German war machine. Every act, no matter how small, carried immense risk. Resistance fighters lived in constant danger. If captured, they faced brutal interrogation, torture, deportation to concentration camps, or execution. Many operated under false identities, moving from safe house to safe house, never staying in one place too long. Trust became a matter of life and death. One careless word could doom an entire network. Women played a crucial and often overlooked role in this underground struggle. They acted as couriers, carried messages hidden in baskets or clothing, sheltered fugitives, and sometimes even participated directly in sabotage. Because they were often less suspected by German authorities, They could move through occupied spaces with slightly more freedom, turning everyday activities into acts of rebellion. In rural areas, resistance groups known as the Maquis took refuge in forests, mountains, and remote villages. These fighters, many of them young men who refused to serve the Vichy regime or be sent to work in Germany, formed armed bands that harassed German patrols, ambushed convoys, and prepared for the day when they could openly rise against the occupiers. Meanwhile, collaboration also took root, adding another layer of tragedy to France's story. Some French officials, police, and citizens worked with the Germans, whether out of fear, ideological alignment, or personal gain. They helped enforce occupation policies, track down resistance members, and round up Jews for deportation. This internal division would haunt France long after the war ended. As months turned into years, the resistance grew stronger, more organized, and more connected to Allied efforts. British intelligence agencies, particularly the Special Operations Executive, began supplying French fighters with weapons, training, and support. Secret drops of arms and supplies were made under cover of darkness, often guided by coded messages broadcast over the radio. Yet the cost of this struggle was immense. Villages suspected of harboring resistance fighters were sometimes subjected to brutal reprisals. Entire communities were burned and innocent civilians were executed as punishment for attacks carried out nearby. The line between heroism and tragedy blurred in these moments as ordinary people paid the price for acts of defiance. Despite the danger, hope slowly began to grow. News of Allied victories in North Africa, Italy, and eventually on the Eastern Front reached even the most isolated corners of occupied France, carried by whispered conversations or crackling radio signals. Each victory reminded the French that the world beyond their borders had not forgotten them. By 1944, the resistance had become a powerful force within France, coordinating with the approaching Allied armies in preparation for liberation. But in 1940, at the moment of defeat and occupation, this future was still distant and uncertain. What existed instead was a nation battered, divided, and humiliated, yet quietly refusing to disappear. The Battle of France did not end with surrender. It transformed into a different kind of war, fought not on open battlefields, but in shadows and secrets and in the hearts of those who refused to accept that their country's story had been permanently rewritten by defeat. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.